Hello, everyone, and welcome to our lecture for Information Study 753, Preserving Information Media, Preservation and Permanence. So our weekly topics for this week are what are different ideas about preservation and permanence, and how have ideas about preservation and permanence evolved over time. So we'll start by revisiting our discussion of what exactly preservation is, which we discussed last week in this course. And we talked about how preservation is the preservation of not only the content of a record, but the context of a record as well. And it's important to note that the content and context of a record changes over time. This can be due to preservation actions that a record's creator or an archivist takes. It could be due to the type of storage that a record is placed in. And so these changes are inevitable, especially with the content. To talk about context a little bit more, as preservation actions are done to the record, this can change the context. It can change the context through which a researcher views a record if they know that a record has been migrated from its original format. And as I believe I touched on last week, it's important for archivists to make researchers aware that these changes have occurred. So just to discuss a couple of ways in which context and content can change over time. And these changes can have an impact on the nature of the record, the informational content within the record, and also how the record is understood. What's interesting about records is that, at least generally speaking, as the technology used to create records has evolved and progressed, records have become less resistant to changes that can be caused by storage, by the passage of time, and this has caused an interesting dilemma and some problems among archivists when it comes to working with records and working with preserving them. So as the Harvey and Mahard article from week 1 mentioned, and the principles of preservation that they list and that we discussed last week a little bit, records contain inherent vice, or the seeds of their own destruction. So there are different characteristics of different types of records that cause them to decay over time. In some instances, such as stone tablets, these seeds of their own destruction may be pretty insignificant. And a stone tablet is very durable. It can be placed in a variety of environments for an incredibly long amount of time. And unless someone comes along and smashes the tablet, it's probably going to survive pretty well. Unless there's some destructive force that causes the tablet to be broken and all the fragments disintegrated, there's going to be a high probability that the information contained in that tablet survives into the future. To jump ahead quite a bit, paper is pretty durable. So you can, place paper in a variety of environments, and, generally speaking, it's going to last for a fair amount of time. It's not nearly as durable as stone tablets, obviously, but generally speaking, it's a pretty durable medium. If you put it in a basement and the basement floods, obviously that is going to have some impact on the paper's durability. But overall, paper is a pretty durable format. And then you look at something like photographs. Photographs are generally fairly durable, but because of the chemicals that are used when photographs are developed and are included in the stock that photographs are developed on, those are some seeds of destruction that can cause photographs to decay and deteriorate somewhat quickly, especially if photographs are in an environment that really isn't good for them. The exposure can start to fade, the paper can start to warp, and bad things can happen that can really decrease the durability of photographs. Audiovisual materials, things like film, can be even less durable than photographs. So the film can warp, the film can decay if it's in bad conditions. And these might be a type of media that only lasts for a couple of decades before you really have to worry about the fragility of film, the fragility of the tape in a cassette. So quite a bit less durable than even photographs and paper, and especially stone tablets. And then you have digital records, which, as we'll talk about throughout this course, are really malleable. They can obviously be easily destroyed and deleted. They can change if the hard drive that a digital file is on is destroyed, and those hard drives or floppy disks can be fairly fragile. So again, as time has progressed and as the technology that people have used to record information has changed, that information has increasingly become less and less permanent and more subject to changes. And this has made maintaining the significant properties of records more difficult for archivists. So it's become more difficult for archivists to retain the characteristics of records that really make them useful for researchers, whether it be the colors in the photograph, the words on a piece of paper, the sound in a film, or so on. As technology has progressed, it's become more and more difficult and more expensive and time-consuming for archivists to make sure that these significant properties are available for researchers in the future. And this really works against what the Mason article describes on page 200 as being the need for researchers to turn back the clock and access records in a condition as authentic as possible. So if you have a piece of paper and it deteriorates over time, that's going to lead to the paper changing in some way. Maybe the ink changes the color, maybe the ink gets warped, maybe the paper itself changes color. And the result of this is that the piece of paper that a researcher is working with, maybe some are quite different from what the piece of paper was like when it was originally created and used. And for some researchers, that can be problematic. It's also important to note that this level of fragility and this difficulty in maintaining records can even vary within types of records or within formats. So some types of paper might be much more durable than others. So if you have paper that is of high quality, maybe it's created using fabric or high quality materials, that's going to be quite a bit more durable than the flimsy carbon copy paper that you might find in an organization's records. Looking at things like photographs, photographs that are created using one media might be much more durable and much more long-lasting than other types of photographs. So, daguerreotypes are a pretty stable photograph, whereas photographs that are created on 35 millimeter film stock, that is a photograph that may be less durable than a daguerreotype. Even with digital records, there are records that are created on a format that is going to require less interventions by archivists and thus less things like migrations that are going to change aspects of the record. So if you have a record that's created as a TIFF, it's likely that an archives can just keep those records as a TIFF and not have to migrate them, and that can increase the permanence of the significant characteristics of that record. So yeah, it's just interesting to note that as technology has progressed, records in a lot of ways have grown more and more fragile and more problematic for archives from the perspective of maintaining the authenticity of records and making sure that the significant properties of records are maintained through time. It's also interesting to think about maintaining the context of records and how this can vary from format to format as well. So this is an instance where digital records really have an advantage over other types of records, over analog records. So with a digital record, you can have metadata that will ideally give researchers a lot of information about what the record is, why it was created, who it was created by, when it was created, and so on. It may be more difficult to get that knowledge from an analog record. You might have to look at the type of tree that was used to create a piece of paper to have some clue over about when the record was created and where it might have been created, and so on. And that's something that the Owens article for this week actually comments on, which was an interesting point about how you can tell a lot about a record just by looking at what type of tree was used to make the paper in a record, or what kind of glue was used for the binding, and so on. So context can be certainly something that doesn't have a high degree of permanence as well. So again, just some examples of what I just talked about how preservation is concerned with preserving the content and context of a record, and some examples of how that might be challenging to different degrees based on the type of record and the format of record that archivists are dealing with. So it's interesting to note that as technology has progressed, the ability of archivists to preserve records has increased over time as well. So archivists have become more capable of conserving records, of restoring records, of providing an emulated environment to records that allows the records to retain or regain, I guess you could say, the essential characteristics of the record for a longer period of time. However, it's important to note that these actions require resources. So if you have records where you aren't so concerned with doing things like emulation and restoration and conservation to preserve their original characteristics, your preservation isn't going to necessarily require a lot of resources. So not a lot of food to sort of fuel your preservation efforts, and not a lot of resources that go into the continued well-being of your records. That may be because you don't really think that your records are worth the effort, or you may not have the resources to do it. But generally speaking, if you're not as concerned about the permanence of these essential characteristics over time, then you can have a preservation program in your archive that is pretty lean and doesn't necessarily require a lot of resources, like Christian Bale and the Machinist. However, if you want Batman Christian Bale, if you want preservation that does maintain these essential characteristics over time through the use of things like emulation and conservation and restoration, that can be quite expensive. Having the skills and the expertise and the resources to do these types of things can really be pretty resource intensive. You know, it takes a lot of money to maintain Batman Christian Bale's physique, right? You have to go to the gym, you have to have a trainer probably, you have to buy and eat high quality food. Whereas if you're a machinist Christian Bale, you can, I think he said when he was filming that movie, he would eat an apple and drink a cup of coffee. Like, you know, that was his meal for the day. So, you know, you have a very lean and resource light preservation program on one side that may not retain the characteristics of records. And then you have a preservation program that does at least attempt to retain these essential characteristics and have a high degree of permanence, but requires a lot of resources for that to happen. And so archivists really have to ask themselves if it's worth it to the archive and to researchers to devote the resources necessary to preserve records in the most authentic way possible. So to preserve records in a way that maintains the significant properties of records over time and provides the most authentic representation of the record that archivists can provide. And as the O'Toole article mentions, archivists have varied from time to time over whether artifactual preservation, which is what the the Owens chapter talks about, is more beneficial to archives and to researchers, or if more informational preservation, which is another one of the characteristics or aspects of preservation that the Owens chapter talks about, is what archivists should really be focusing on. Owen suggests that archivists have mostly been fixated on informational preservation throughout time. The O'Toole article mentions a few years, or maybe like a decade in the 70s, where archivists were really more concerned with trying to preserve records as authentically as possible. Generally speaking, for a variety of reasons, archivists have mostly been focusing on the informational preservation of records. And I'm sure that resources has been a big thing that archivists have had to consider in making this decision. The sheer number of records, which is something that the O'Toole article touches on, has led archivists to realize that we can't provide conservation and restoration to every single record out there. We have to be selective about what we choose. So those are two factors that have really led archivists, generally speaking, to adopt more of the Christian Bale and the Machinist type of preservation, as opposed to Batman Christian Bale. Although, wow, Batman Christian Bale, talk about appealing, right? But it's not something that every archive could do, and it's not necessarily something that every archive should do, because as O'Toole notes, if archivists aren't concerned about preserving every single record, to the very extent of possibility, then that can free up a lot of resources to do other activities within the archive that may be more beneficial for the archive. And so one interesting appraisal consideration that an archive might make when appraising records is how much content and context has been lost in the records before they even come into an archive. So if you are looking at a set of records and it's obviously obvious that they've deteriorated quite a bit, and that the level of permanence in the content and or the context hasn't been that great, then you as an archivist might say, okay, well, it's going to cost us a ton of money to even continue to care for these records, let alone conserve or restore them. And we're just not capable of making that investment in these records. So we're going to say, no, thank you. So maybe the records are in our paper records and they've just decayed so much, or they are in a file format that it's going to be really difficult for you to provide meaningful, authentic access to those records. And so you just might have to say, okay, this is kind of beyond our resources. This is asking for Batman Christian Bale when really the best we can provide is machinist Christian Bale. And we're gonna have to pass on these records for that reason. So archivists can address this idea of permanence in a few different ways. So one thing that an archive can do is take the original record and then purchase some equipment or invest the resources in a way that makes it possible for a copy of the original record to be available to researchers. So the access copy of the record might be a copy of the original and not an access copy that has been changed through migration or other actions that an archive might take. And again, this can be fairly expensive. So it might take a fair amount of resources to copy the record to begin with, and then have access to, a projector or an emulation program that allows researchers to access the most authentic copy of that record as possible. One other thing that archivists might do is they might take the original record and they might re-encode this record into a different format, which is more accessible for researchers. So you might take 8mm film, and rather than copy that film onto another reel and project it using the appropriate film projector, you might just digitize it and provide access to that copy to researchers. Now, the problem with this is that when you change 8mm film to a digital copy, that's going to result in some of the information contained in that film being lost or being changed. So the digitized copy isn't going to look and feel the same way that the original 8mm film will. So when researchers view this, it's going to be a different experience from if they had viewed the original film in its original format. However, a benefit of this is that it can be fairly inexpensive. It's incredibly inexpensive to migrate digital records to a different format. There are tools out there that can do this quite readily and freely. If you were to buy an 8mm projector and copy the film onto a different reel and provide that to researchers, that's going to be a lot of resources that go into that that particular preservation preservation style. Okay, so one other thing that archivists might do is that they may take the original record and they may do some kind of conservation or restoration actions upon the record and provide that original record for researchers to look at. So this type of access for researchers can be fairly authentic. Obviously, when you conserve or restore something, that it's possible that there may be some changes to the record. The binding might be different, some colors might change. There are a variety of things that might happen. But what the researcher is going to look at in the end is hopefully, based on the skill of the conservation or restoration team, going to be something that is fairly authentic. And that can be beneficial for researchers. But conservation and restoration work can be very expensive. You're talking about a skill set that not a lot of people have, that can require a lot of resources to carry out. And practically speaking, that's not something that many archives can really invest in. It's just not sustainable in most cases. So another thing that archives might do is they might just take the original copy, really do nothing to it, maybe provide very basic preservation actions like taking out staples or refoldering, and then just provide access to those original records. And this is something that is fairly inexpensive. And this is something that, at least from my experience as an archivist and my sort of knowledge of archival practice, this is something that the archives do fairly commonly. The benefits here is that archives are able to have access to a record that is fairly authentic, assuming that there haven't been too many changes done to the record, either before or after they came into archival custody. The negatives is that this might be the only copy that exists. And if archives somehow lose the record, or if the record is damaged in some way, then the record may be lost, and that information may not survive and be available anywhere else. So one of the principles that Harvey and Mahard mentions is to make multiple copies. And this kind of goes against that principle, because you're providing access to the only copy of a record and of information that you might have. So there's more risk that something could go wrong and this record could be destroyed or stolen or lost or who knows what, and that information can be lost. But again, it is something that is done fairly commonly in archives, because right here, it's fairly inexpensive to do. And even doing things like refoldering and taking out paper clips and staples, is optional for archives. So yeah, there's really a whole spectrum of different preservation approaches and philosophies that archives can engage in, and all of them can, affect the permanence of significant characteristics and can affect the authenticity of the records that researchers interact with and work with. And archives really have to do what they can within the framework of the resources that they are able to bring to bear, the expertise that they're able to bring to bear, the time that they're able to bring to bear. And, that's just kind of the practical reality of the situation that archives find themselves in, unfortunately. So this can really lead you to think, okay, well, isn't it possible to have kind of a mixed approach, and in some cases to try and provide access to records that are fairly authentic and have a high degree of permanence in the significant characteristics of the record from the time that the record was created to the time that a researcher is looking at the record. Does it have to be an all or nothing approach? And NPLP, which the McCann article for this week touches on, would say, no, you really have the option of having a preservation plan or policy in place that has one set of standards and goals for most records, and perhaps for a few records, you try and maintain the authenticity and try and retain the significant characteristics of a record to a greater degree. And then for fewer still records, you really make a lot of resource-intensive efforts towards making sure that records remain as authentic as possible and that the significant characteristics of these records remain permanent for as long as that can take place. So, these might be records where you don't do things like removing staples, you don't do things like refoldering, you just kind of put them in an area that's hopefully reasonably climate controlled and hope for the best. These might be records where, you recognize that the records are important, so you do things like removing staples, you do refoldering, you do take out paper clips, you do make sure that these records are in a climate controlled area that is really going to support the permanence of the records and the different characteristics of records into the future. And then for the small sliver of records that you're really going to focus on, these might be ones where you think about doing conservation work, or these might be ones where you put in an area that you're able to have the greatest control over the climate in. These might be the ones where you make copies that are as close to the original as possible. Maybe you invest some money in providing a projector that researchers can have access to really get the look and feel of the records as close to possible as what it was like when the record was created. But then it really becomes the question of sort of ethically, how do you determine which records receive what kind of treatment? So the O'Toole article talks about the idea of intrinsic value, so that records have some kind of significance that sort of singles them out as being worthy of a high degree of permanence. So, I'm not a big fan of intrinsic value. I think if you read the definition of intrinsic value in the article, you could really apply that to, pretty much any record. You might look at things like the value to researchers. So how valuable do we think this set of records is to to the researchers that we know are coming to our repository, assuming that you even know that. If you think that records are going to be very valuable to your researchers, then you might make sure that they are preserved very carefully, and the characteristics of records are preserved very carefully. If you think that they're kind of peripherally interesting to your researchers, then you might not devote as much resources to preserving them. You might look at the connection between records and your archive's mission. That might be something that informs your consideration. You might think about the connection between the records and certain members of the public. So if you're thinking practically, and you know that some records in your archives are ones that are important to people who have influence over your archive and over the resources that your archive has to operate, then you might try and keep those records in really pristine condition. And then you can say to that person, hey, look, we're really making an effort to preserve these records. And, that really shows why our archive is valuable. So kind of thinking practically about what you choose to preserve and how you choose to preserve it. The O'Toole article mentions 0.5% of records is ultimately being worth of things like conservation and restoration. So, that might be something that you think of as an archivist as well. And again, this decision making really needs to be focused on the archive's resources and expertise. And it really should be an honest examination of why the archive is making the decisions it makes, and a recognition that the choices that archives make about preservation, about the degree of permanence they want records to have, results in the privileging of some records and some information over other records and other information. So it's really important for archives to think about the implications of the decisions that they make when it comes to making these decisions about the permanence of records. And we've talked about transparency and preservation before. These are choices that archives should ideally be pretty transparent about. So we decided to really focus on preserving these records for this particular reason. And just making that clear to the public, making it clear to the researchers that use the archive, making it clear to the resource allocators that fund the archive, and just kind of letting everyone know why certain decisions were made. And again, it's really important to think about how these decisions can impact researchers and impact social memory. So if you put records in conditions that aren't that great, and that results in significant characteristics of a record being decayed or being lost, if it results in the artifactual information that the Owens chapter talks about not being available to researchers, that can really impact how researchers view and how they interact with records. So as things decay, as archivists make choices to preserve records in a particular way, that can result in information being lost, and potentially the context of a record being misinterpreted or misunderstood, and those misinterpretations and misunderstandings being spread into the public. So the Owens chapter talks about the Declaration of Independence and how for a while people didn't realize that Thomas Jefferson had crossed out subjects and put in the word citizens, and that can really impact how people understand what the Declaration of Independence was, what it was meant to do, and so on. And if you lose information like that, then it can really undermine how people view the record and how they interpret the record. So making these decisions about how records are preserved really places archives in the role of, in some ways, being creators of the records themselves, and having a creative role in how the records are interpreted and used. And traditionally, this hasn't been something that the archival profession has been too comfortable with or too fond of, but it's just kind of an inevitable part of having limited resources to preserve information into the future, and having to make decisions about preservation based on the reality of those limited resources. So it's interesting to think how the idea of permanence and how the idea of the MPLP sort of view of preservation, which the McCann article kind of takes on, connects with the preservation principles from the Harvey and Mahard article. So you could talk about how MPLP and the idea of just kind of ignoring preservation can work against the principle of taking action now is better than doing nothing. If you're doing MPLP and you're not really taking a close look at your records or the preservation needs that it takes, essentially you're just saying we're going to do nothing. We're not going to take the time to really look at these records and see what we can do to help them remain accessible into the future. You could argue that if you take the MPLP approach towards preservation, and in the vast majority of cases, you're not really going to focus on preservation too much, you're not really taking the active managed care that preservation requires. You're just kind of saying, we're going to take a very inactive approach. We're going to put this stuff in a, an area that is hopefully reasonably climate controlled. Although, as McCann notes, the green article didn't really comment on what climate controlled meant, and hope for the best. And we're not really going to have an active managed role in preserving these records and in supporting the permanence of the significant characteristics of these records into the future. You could argue that MPLP doesn't even do the minimum necessary to stabilize and preserve records. Again, if you're not looking at them, if you're not even getting an idea of what is needed to stabilize and preserve the object, then you're certainly not doing the minimum necessary to stabilize and preserve the records in a collection. This one might be a little bit of a more peripheral connection, but preservation action should not harm the object. If you're saying that my approach towards preservation is not to do anything, if my preservation action is inaction, then that quite possibly is going to harm the object. It is going to result in the object becoming sort of less permanent, and it's going to make it more likely that information contained within that record and perhaps even and the content of that record is going to be harmed and is going to be less available to researchers in the future. One aspect of these principles that that MPLP preservation does support is the idea of preferring preservation actions that address large quantities of material over actions that focus on individual objects. That's really the essence of MPLP. But you could make the argument that, meeting this one sort of principle or goal of preservation may not be worth ignoring all these other aspects of preservation that archivists should be thinking about when they are preserving records. So, okay, it's great that you're addressing large quantities of material, but if you're not doing these other things, then okay, is it really worth it to do this one part of preservation when you're ignoring these other parts? And I'm sure there are other principles in here that you could connect to MPLP and connect to sort of a broad sort of non-interactive philosophy of preservation, but these were a few that just kind of stood out to me. You could maybe argue that MPLP preservation isn't really ethical, that it's not an ethical way for archivists to handle their records because of the possibility that it's going to lead to archives being destroyed sooner than they would be otherwise. So again, we have this idea of preserving either the informational content of the record or the artifactual content, which is the basis of the Owens chapter, and to a lesser extent of the O'Toole article, and a little bit of the McCann article as well. Mason kind of touches on it a little bit. And as Owens notes, many or even most researchers are fine with viewing informational content or access copies that are less authentic. They may say, okay, well, I know that I'm looking at a digital scan of this film. I'm not looking at it on sort of the original 8mm film stock through an 8mm projector, but that's fine. I understand that that's going on. I'm willing to make these compromises in order to access the record in a convenient way. So that's also something that archivists might consider when they're determining what preservation actions to provide with a record. Do your researchers really care if what they look at isn't necessarily the most authentic version of a record. You know, in some instances, they just may value the accessibility of the record, and they may be fine with what they're looking at as long as it's easy for them to access. And even when you're looking at the context of a record, you know, many researchers may not need to know every way that a record has changed over time. They may not need to know the entire context of a record. So if archives aren't able to, you know, scrupulously document every way that a record has changed since the very moment of its creation, researchers may not really care. They may say, all right, well, you know, we have some idea that this record has changed. Maybe we have sort of the big, the highlights of how this record has changed over time, either because of metadata or because of, you know, we can tell that the record is a little bit faded, or that, you know, we see these issues going on in the record. And that's fine. We don't need to know the whole story. We don't need to know every exacting detail. And so that's something that that archivists might keep in mind as well when they're choosing how and whether to preserve records. You don't want the perfect to get in the way of the good when it comes to preservation. You don't want to get so wrapped up in providing the most authentic representation of a record possible when your researchers may not really care about that, and when that may take resources from other important things that an archive has to do. So while a lack of permanence can affect a record's authenticity, it doesn't necessarily affect a record's authenticity in ways that are really going to bother researchers or lead to the records being completely useless. So again, sometimes you just have to pick your poison and do the best that you can, and at the very least, be transparent about what decisions were made. Be as forthcoming and transparent as possible about how records have changed over time, and just hoping that your researchers are still able to make use of the records despite any changes to the content or context that have occurred either before the record came to the archive or while in archival custody. And it's important to note that, you know, records can change and they can be re-encoded several times. So a record may be created and may be re-encoded by the creator of the record before it even ends up in the archive, and may be re-encoded once the records are in the archive, and it may continue into the indefinite future. So there are a lot of opportunities for the content and context of records to lose their permanence. And again, it just goes back to this idea of communicating these changes to researchers as much as possible. You know, hopefully having some control over these changes. You know, you certainly don't want changes happening to your records that you're not aware of, because, you know, they can really kind of spiral out of control, and that can result in the record really becoming damaged or not usable. But, you know, if an archive has a record into the indefinite future, then the records are going to continue to change, and the context of the record is going to continue to change. And, you know, it's inevitable. It's something that an archive has to deal with. It's something that an archive agrees to deal with when they say, yes, we want this record, we agree to take this record into our archive, and we agree to provide access to it into the future. Okay, so again, to kind of review a little bit and talk about the implications of the idea of permanence within records and how archivists approach permanence in different ways, permanence of both the context and the content of records. You know, as I mentioned, archivists must think deliberately about what they are preserving and why. So which records are we focusing on, and really trying to keep them as authentic as possible. And why are we doing that? Are we doing it because these records are important to our researchers? Are we doing it because we think these records are important to a donor who has given money to our archive in the past? What's sort of the thought process behind these decisions that we're making? And as the tool article, not being so worried about the permanence of records and focusing more on the informational content of records as opposed to the artifactual content of records, is that it can allow you to focus on other activities that archives carry out, which can be really beneficial. If you aren't so focused on preservation, then perhaps that gives you more time and money for appraisal, arrangement, description, outreach, some of the other important things that archives do. And again, as I mentioned, all these changes or all these choices must be made within the framework of an archives resource. If you focus on preserving a lot of records, and restoring them and conserving them, and you don't have money to do appraisal, or you don't have money to do outreach, or you don't have money or resources to arrange and describe your records, then that's probably a problem. So you kind of have to think about what resources your archive has to bear and how much of that should be devoted towards preserving a certain record or a certain set of records. And again, the importance of transparency, and that archives should really be clear to researchers and donors about the permanence choices that they have made. As O'Toole mentions, this might turn some donors off, and some donors might think, oh, well, I'm not going to donate to your archive if you're not going to take care of my records to, the nth degree. But, you just have to be honest and open and transparent and realistic with people, and hope that they are still willing to support your archive. So, okay, we'll go ahead and call it a lecture there. I hope that you have enjoyed reading the readings for this week. I think the Owens chapter was especially interesting, and I really like the O'Toole article as well. And I hope that it has helped you learn more about preservation and the different considerations related to both analog and digital preservation that archivists have to make. And it'll definitely, the idea of permanence is something that we will definitely revisit really throughout every week for the rest of this course. So we'll come back and talk about this concept of permanence and authenticity and significant properties, significant characteristics as we progress through this semester. So thank you for listening. As always, let me know if you have any questions. Don't forget to smash that like and subscribe button, and I will be in touch soon. Have a good one.